The year is 1851, and the Great Exhibition is dazzling London. Crystal Palace shines with the marvels of industry, inventions, and empire. Outside, men in top hats stroll arm in arm with wives in hoop skirts, all the world convinced that the Victorian age is an era of discipline, order, and morality. But behind lace curtains, in gaslit parlors, and shadowed streets, another story unfolds. A story the Victorians themselves whispered in private but never admitted in public. A story of repression, obsession, and desire. Because the truth is this: the Victorian era, often remembered for prudishness and restraint, was also a time of hidden passion, secret practices, and contradictions so sharp they could cut through silk. Doctors preached morality, but their offices overflowed with patients confessing their nervous afflictions. Clergymen thundered about purity, while London's underworld thrived with more brothels than schools. Husbands insisted on modest wives, yet bought clandestine guides to sexual pleasure. Some printed as early as the 1830s and passed hand to hand like contraband. And so tonight, we are stepping into the shadows of the Victorian bedroom. You re-listening to Whispers of History, where the past reveals the secrets it tried to hide. Subscribe now, because this journey into the dark and forbidden is only just beginning. Let's begin with the greatest irony of all. The Victorians spoke endlessly of purity, yet thought of sex constantly. One need only glance at the era's medical books to see the obsession. In 1839, Dr. William Acton, one of the period's most quoted physicians, wrote that the majority of women are not very much troubled with sexual feeling of any kind. This line was repeated so often it became dogma, painting women as passive beings. But the reality, women, too, had desires, and they sought ways to explore them, even when society denied them a voice. Take the case of Sarah D., a middle-class woman in 1867, who visited her physician not for illness, but for what she described as restlessness and yearning. Doctors labeled it hysteria, a cultural diagnosis for women who expressed unhappiness, desire, or frustration. And the treatment, manual stimulation by physicians or midwives, often with vibrating tools. The very origin of the vibrator, patented in 1869. Imagine, in the very era we call prudish, medical science quietly invented one of the most infamous sexual devices of all time. But while doctors treated desire in the clinic, outside, the streets of London told a harsher story. By the 1850s, London had an estimated 50,000 prostitutes, more than the number of bakers, butchers, or teachers. They worked in dimly lit alleys, in cheap music halls, even in the grand boulevards. The Contagious Diseases Acts of the 1860s, passed by Parliament, allowed police to forcibly examine suspected prostitutes for venereal disease. These inspections were invasive, humiliating, and carried out without consent. Women who refused could be imprisoned. Behind the polished image of empire, thousands of women lived and suffered under laws that treated their bodies as property of the state. And yet, brothels flourished, some ordinary, others bizarre. There were flagellation brothels where clients paid for whipping sessions, reflecting a hidden Victorian fascination with pain and discipline. Erotic prints, known as flagellant literature, circulated as early as the 1820s, sold discreetly in bookshops or hidden under counters. Wealthy men often owned collections, stored in secret cabinets they unlocked only when alone. What makes this even more fascinating is the double life of society. In drawing rooms, families spoke of virtue, purity, and prayer. But in bedrooms, in doctors' offices, and in hidden clubs, secrets thrived. The contrast was intoxicating. Silk gloves in public, raw flesh in private. The Victorians even invented new rules to maintain their facade. Couples were encouraged to avoid looking at each other during intercourse. Women were told to endure without pleasure. Yet hidden beneath these prescriptions were manuals like Aristotle's masterpiece, a centuries-old sex guide still in circulation in the 19th century. passed in brown paper wrappings. It promised advice on passion, fertility, and pleasure. The same society that demanded modesty kept one foot firmly planted in desire. And then there were the scandals, whispers that spread like wildfire through the press. In 1870, police raided a house in London where elite men gathered for unnatural practices, a coded reference to homosexuality, then illegal. Trials splashed names across newspapers, ruining reputations. Yet underground networks of same-sex desire persisted, meeting in taverns, public baths, and discreet clubs. To live such a life meant constant danger, but also proof that desire cannot be legislated away. So here lies the paradox. The Victorian era was outwardly strict, but inwardly sensual. Every law against pleasure created new ways to pursue it. Every sermon on purity was met with whispers of scandal. Behind the corsets and cravats, passion simmered, forbidden but never extinguished. And the most haunting truth, many of these secrets are preserved not in confessions but in objects. Erotic photographs, taken as early as the 1850s, still survive, showing women in stockings, men posing nude, couples caught in acts society pretended did not exist. These images remind us that behind every stern portrait of Queen Victoria, there was another world, one of longing, desire, and experimentation, which leaves us with a question. If the Victorians lived in such contradiction, did they ever truly believe in their own rules? Or did they know, even then, that purity was just a mask? The curtain rises again, this time not on London's grand boulevards, but in the shadowy corners of bookshops and parlours. If the streets swarmed with brothels, the printing presses of the Victorian era churned out something just as forbidden: erotic literature. Officially, Britain prided itself on moral decency. Unofficially, demand for erotic novels was so high the publishers risked prison to satisfy it. Take My Secret Life, published in 1888, a sprawling memoir of sexual encounters written by a man known only as Walter, running to 11 volumes. It detailed everything from affairs with prostitutes to encounters with servants. It was never sold openly. Copies passed hand to hand among collectors, each transaction hushed, each page a defiance of Victorian restraint. Authorities labelled such works obscene, but the very fact they survived tells us the appetite for them was vast. Even more popular was the underground trade in flagellant novels, texts devoted to the pleasures of whipping and discipline. Titles like Exhibition of Female Flagellants, 1830, or Birch and Bouquet, c. 1870, reveal an obsession with pain and submission that seems to echo the rigidity of Victorian life itself. Perhaps in a world where men and women lived under suffocating rules, the allure of punishment became its own dark seduction. But literature wasn't the only outlet. Erotic photographs flourished, even though photography itself was still new. By the 1850s, clandestine studios in London and Paris offered sepia-toned images of women in corsets, stockings, and sometimes nothing at all. Some photographs were playful, others explicit, yet all were sold in discreet portfolios. For the wealthy, collecting such images became a hidden pastime, a way of owning a slice of the forbidden. For working-class men, a single print, hidden beneath a mattress, could be a treasure of rebellion. While women were diagnosed with hysteria for expressing desire, men's sexuality was policed in different ways. The greatest obsession, masturbation, doctors called it self-abuse, and entire manuals warned of its dangers. They claimed it caused blindness, madness, weakness, even death. Parents were advised to watch their sons closely, to prevent them from straying into what was labeled a moral and medical sin. The paranoia was so strong that inventors created bizarre devices to prevent the act. One advertisement from 1871 offered a chastity belt for boys, made of metal and leather, designed to lock over the genitals at night. Others recommended sewing the foreskin shut or applying caustic chemicals to discourage temptation. These cures were brutal, unscientific, and rooted in fear. Fear that pleasure could unravel the very fabric of society. But even here, contradictions thrived. While doctors condemned masturbation, they quietly treated wealthy patients for the very nervous conditions it supposedly caused. And in some circles, manuals circulated that taught men how to avoid excess while still indulging carefully. The same society that thundered against desire always found loopholes to satisfy it. Then there were the scandals that rocked the elite. In 1889, the Cleveland Street Scandal exposed a male brothel in London's West End, frequented by high-ranking officials and aristocrats. Newspapers splashed the names of clients across their pages, though some were carefully protected by influence. The scandal revealed not only the existence of a hidden homosexual network, illegal at the time, but the hypocrisy of a society that publicly condemned what its leaders practiced in secret. Even Queen Victoria herself was drawn into the conversation, not personally, but through rumor. When Parliament debated outlawing homosexual practices, some MPs suggested including women. The story goes that Queen Victoria refused to believe women could ever engage in sexual activity with each other, and so lesbianism was never explicitly criminalized. Whether this anecdote is true or not, it highlights the blind spots of Victorian law. The things they refused to see became invisible, while the things they feared most were hunted relentlessly. The world of servants also held its own secrets. In grand houses, footmen and maids lived in close quarters, their lives shaped by strict hierarchies. Yet letters and court records reveal countless liaisons between masters and maids, mistresses and coachmen. These relationships blurred the lines of power and consent, often hidden until pregnancy or scandal forced them into the open. For the Victorians, the home was a symbol of purity, but within its walls, intimacy unfolded in complex, often troubling ways. And what of the medical profession? Just as women were diagnosed with hysteria, men were often diagnosed with spermatoria, the supposed excessive loss of semen. Physicians warned that even nocturnal emissions were dangerous, draining life force from the body. Treatments ranged from cold baths to circumcision, to the prescription of strict diets and exercise. Once again, the Victorian body became a battlefield where desire and discipline collided. The contradictions are dizzying. A society that condemned pleasure also produced vibrators. A society that banned obscenity consumed more erotic novels than ever before. A society that preached purity tolerated an underworld of brothels, flagellant clubs, and scandals that reached into the highest offices of power. So we must ask, did the Victorians truly believe in their own rules, or did they thrive on the thrill of breaking them? Was repression the point, not to eliminate desire, but to make it more dangerous, more intoxicating, more irresistible? Because if the Victorians were anything, they were masters of contradiction, and their secrets were not confined to the elite. In the next part, we'll turn to the ordinary people of the era, the factory workers, the soldiers, the shop girls, and discover how they navigated a world where sexuality was hidden, yet always just beneath the surface. If the scandals of aristocrats filled the newspapers, the quiet struggles and desires of ordinary Victorians lived in silence. Yet their stories, hidden in court records, diaries, and police reports, reveal a world just as complex, just as filled with secrets, as the drawing rooms of the elite. Take the streets of industrial Manchester in the 1860s. The city was booming with factories, and workers crowded into slums where privacy was rare. Entire families often lived in a single room, separated by thin curtains or not at all. For young couples, this meant stolen moments of intimacy in alleyways, parks, or rented rooms above taverns. The lack of space bred both repression and rebellion. Respectability demanded chastity, yet the reality of life made desire impossible to ignore. Records from police courts show how authorities sought to control working-class sexuality. Couples caught embracing in public were fined for indecency. Prostitutes were arrested under the Contagious Diseases Acts and forced into examinations. Even singing Bodhi songs in pubs could lead to charges of immorality. But repression did not erase desire, it merely pushed it into new forms. Soldiers and sailors, too, carried their own reputations. In garrison towns like Portsmouth or Aldershot, brothels lined the streets catering to enlisted men. Venereal disease became such a concern that military doctors issued pamphlets warning soldiers of the dangers of fallen women. Yet these same men were expected to remain celibate outside marriage, an impossible standard that bred hypocrisy. Military camps became hotbeds of rumor, secret liaisons, and quiet contradictions. For working-class women, sexuality was often tied to survival. Many turned to prostitution not by choice but necessity. The loss of a husband, the need to feed children, or the lack of employment options left women with few alternatives. In London's East End in the 1880s, police estimated that 1 in every 16 women engaged in sex work at some point. These women faced violence, disease, and stigma, yet their existence revealed the cracks in the Victorian facade of purity. Behind the respectable front doors of middle-class homes, working-class women bore the burden of society's double standards. But desire was not only tied to poverty or desperation. Ordinary Victorians also sought love and intimacy in ways both inventive and tender. Letters from young lovers, preserved in archives, show couples navigating the strict codes of courtship with passion barely restrained. One letter from 1874, written by a factory clerk to his sweetheart, speaks of aching to steal a kiss in the shadows of the mill, a line so raw it could have been penned today. Beneath the lace and steel of the age, ordinary people longed and loved as fiercely as any aristocrat. Another window into working-class sexuality comes from the diaries of servants. In large households, maids and footmen often lived under the constant gaze of employers, yet desire found ways to flourish. In one case from Bath in 1862, a maid was dismissed after being discovered with a groom in the stables. Her dismissal was not unusual, but the diary of the lady of the house reveals the hypocrisy. She wrote scathingly of her servant's sin, while her own husband quietly kept a mistress in town. The rules of morality were rarely applied equally. The contradictions extended to marriage itself. For many working-class couples, weddings came late, after years of cohabitation, or what was known as trial marriage. Church records reveal that couples often baptized their children before officially marrying, suggesting that intimacy outside wedlock was far more common than Victorian ideals admitted. Respectability demanded denial, but the reality was written in parish books and census records. Even the language of the working class reflected their hidden world of intimacy. Popular ballads and tavern songs carried double meanings, with verses about plucking roses or drawing ale serving as thinly veiled references to sex. These songs, often sung after long hours in factories or fields, gave voice to desires that society tried to silence. The policing of ordinary sexuality also gave rise to darker outcomes. Inquests reveal cases of infanticide where desperate young mothers, unable to support illegitimate children, abandoned or killed them. The 1860s and 70s saw a rise in such cases, leading to debates about contraception and morality. Pamphlets warning against baby farmers, women who took in unwanted infants for money, circulated widely, exposing the tragic consequences of a society that offered no mercy to women who strayed from its rigid codes. But in the midst of repression, there was also experimentation. By the late 19th century, the working class had access to cheap editions of erotic literature, often smuggled in from France. Pornographic postcards, known as French letters, were sold under the counter in pubs or markets. These images, crude but daring, became tokens of rebellion against the suffocating morality of the age. And then there were the secret clubs. In cities like London and Liverpool, Groups of working men and women gathered in rented rooms to share erotic stories, drink, and defy the rules. Police occasionally raided these gatherings, recording in court documents the bawdy jokes and shocking performances they uncovered. The existence of such clubs shows that even the most ordinary Victorians sought spaces where they could breathe free from judgment, if only for a night. So while the newspapers focused on scandals of lords and queens, the true story of Victorian sexuality was written in the lives of factory girls, soldiers, and servants. Their experiences remind us that the age's contradictions were not confined to the elite. They stretched across every class, every street, every household, which leaves us with a haunting thought: if even the poorest and most powerless found ways to bend the rules, perhaps the Victorian obsession with purity was never as strong as it appeared. Perhaps it was always a fragile mask, cracking under the weight of human desire. The Victorians may have cloaked themselves in moral sermons, but they were also obsessed with cataloguing, classifying, and measuring everything, from the wings of butterflies to the curves of human desire. And in this scientific zeal, sex became not only a subject of fascination, but also of experimentation. By the 1840s, pamphlets on birth control circulated quietly through cities, though rarely admitted openly. One of the most infamous was Charles Knowlton's Fruits of Philosophy, 1832, a manual that dared to describe contraception. Its suggestions were modest: sponges, douches, rhythm, yet radical for its time. In Britain, when publisher Charles Bradlaugh and activist Annie Besant reprinted it in 1877, they were arrested for obscenity. The trial electrified the country, not because people didn't know about sex, but because it revealed just how fiercely authorities sought to control knowledge of it. Ironically, the publicity sent the pamphlet sales soaring, spreading information further than ever before. Condoms, too, became quietly popular, though rarely mentioned in polite society. Often made from animal intestines, they were sold discreetly in apothecaries, or even marketed as disease preventatives, rather than contraceptives. By the 1850s, vulcanized Rubbermaid condoms, cheaper and more durable, ushering in a small revolution in private bedrooms. Yet to admit their use publicly was scandalous. A married couple might whisper about them, but to be caught with one could stain reputations beyond repair. At the same time, Victorian medicine was deeply contradictory. While doctors condemned masturbation and promoted chastity, they also invented tools that reshaped sexuality itself. The most infamous was the electromechanical vibrator, patented in 1869, designed to treat hysteria in women. Physicians would use the device to induce what they called paroxysms. In other words, orgasms, believing it a medical cure for female restlessness. Here, under the guise of treatment, Victorian doctors massaged away the very desires society denied. Yet the contradictions grew sharper as the century advanced. On one hand, purity leagues preached abstinence and warned against vice. On the other, scientists began to catalogue sexual practices with cold precision. One of the most important figures was Havelock Ellis, whose studies on sexuality in the late 19th century broke taboos by documenting homosexuality, fetishes, and female desire. His work would scandalize the era, but lay the foundation for modern sexology. Ellis dared to suggest what Victorians least wanted to hear: that desire was natural, varied, and far broader than the rigid rules of society allowed. Still, the medical gaze could be cruel. Many doctors pathologized same-sex attraction, labeling it a disease or degeneracy. Men accused of homosexuality were subjected to examinations, their bodies prodded for supposed signs of perversion. Women were often dismissed entirely, their love for each other ignored or erased. Science promised enlightenment, but too often it reinforced the very prejudices it claimed to expose. The contradictions extended to contraception. By the 1870s, advocates like Besant argued that limiting family size was essential to lifting working-class families out of poverty. But the law, guided by the 1857 Obscene Publications Act, treated contraceptive advice as pornography. Pamphlets were seized, publishers fined, activists jailed. Even when doctors quietly advised wealthier patients, poorer families were denied access to knowledge that could have transformed their lives. Desire, once again, was policed not only by morality, but by class. And then there were the quack cures. Advertisements filled Victorian newspapers offering pills, ointments, and devices promising to cure lost manhood or female weakness. Many were thinly disguised aphrodisiacs or crude contraceptives. Others were outright dangerous, laced with mercury, arsenic, or opium. The demand was enormous, and charlatans thrived on secrecy. The very repression of sexual conversation created fertile ground for exploitation. But while some medical voices fueled fear, others pushed boundaries. Ellis was not alone. Thinkers like Richard von Krafting in Germany published case studies of unusual sexual practices collected from patients, court cases, and confessions. His Psychopathia Sexualis, 1886, was intended for physicians, but was devoured by curious readers eager to learn about fetishes, sadomasochism, and deviant desires. For all its clinical language, the book became a bestseller, feeding the very appetites it claimed to study. The Victorians thus built a strange paradox. They criminalized desire, yet documented it obsessively. They denounced contraception, yet quietly used it. They condemned homosexuality, yet wrote case studies about it. The very era remembered as prudish may have been the most fascinated by sex in all its forms. Consider the case of Dr. Isaac Baker Brown, a London physician in the 1860s. He believed that masturbation in women caused hysteria, epilepsy, even insanity. His solution, clitoridectomy, the surgical removal of the clitoris. He performed the procedure on dozens of women, often without proper consent, claiming to cure them. When his practices became public, he was expelled from the obstetrical society, but the fact he operated at all shows how medical authority could transform repression into cruelty. Beneath the veneer of science, women's bodies were subjected to both experimentation and violation. And yet, in quieter corners, other doctors saw things differently. Some midwives, discreetly and against the grain of law, taught women about contraception. Some physicians challenged myths about masturbation and argued for sexual health rather than punishment. By the late 19th century, whispers of change grew louder. Feminists began to argue that women not only had desires but rights within marriage. The right to refuse, the right to enjoy, the right to control their own fertility. So here lies the great contradiction of Victorian science. It both reinforced oppression and laid the foundation for liberation. Its instruments were often tools of control, but its studies opened doors to conversations once unthinkable. And yet, the question lingers. Did the Victorians truly want enlightenment, or were they driven by voyeurism, by a desire to peer into the very secrets they claimed to despise? Was science a lantern of truth, or just another mask for curiosity and control? Step off the polished streets of Mayfair, past the gas lamps and carriages, and down into the crooked alleys of Whitechapel or Soho, and you would find another London. A world where the rules of Queen Victoria's empire bent, twisted, and sometimes broke entirely. Because if science catalogued desire and doctors tried to cure it, the underworld lived it. And here, in the shadows, Victorian sexuality revealed its darkest secrets. By the 1850s, London was infamous for its brothels. Estimates ranged from 30,000 to 50,000 prostitutes working in the city, from luxurious establishments serving the wealthy to grim lodging houses where survival was the only currency. William Acton, the same physician who declared women passionless, admitted in 1857 that prostitution was an inevitable evil, a statement that revealed how deeply sex work was woven into the fabric of the city. But these weren't all the same. Some brothels specialized in bizarre or forbidden fantasies. The so-called flagellation houses catered to men who paid to be whipped by dominatrixes dressed in leather or fine gowns. In one notorious establishment, clients were required to recite prayers while being beaten, blending sin, shame, and desire into a ritual of punishment. Others catered to cross-dressing. Men of influence, some with seats in parliament, would slip into gowns and corsets, their wigs powdered, their makeup painted carefully, to spend the night in masquerade. Police reports from the 1870s describe raids on such molly houses, where men danced together, kissed, and adopted female names. Though dangerous, sodomy carried a penalty of imprisonment with hard labor. These hidden communities carved out spaces of freedom within repression. The coded world extended beyond brothels. Advertisements in newspapers carried veiled invitations. A notice offering French lessons might not refer to language at all, but to a prostitute specializing in oral sex. Ads for nursing services or companionship were equally suspect, their true meaning decipherable only to those in the know. The very constraints of Victorian society bred a secret language, an underground code that allowed forbidden pleasures to thrive. Even more shocking was the trade in erotic art and objects. Parisian imports flooded into London, from explicit prints to ivory figurines, smuggled past customs and sold in private clubs. Collectors, often gentlemen of wealth, hid them in locked cabinets or disguised them as classical art. One aristocrat's estate inventory from 1872 listed Greek vases, which upon closer inspection were covered in explicit scenes. Respectability on the outside, obscenity within. The perfect metaphor for the age. But the underworld also exposed the brutality of repression. Child prostitution was rampant, with girls as young as 12 forced into sex work by poverty or coercion. Journalist W.T. Date Stead S. Yalba Bawu, the maiden tribute of modern Babylon, shocked the public by revealing how easily a child could be purchased in London. His story, detailing the abduction of a 13-year-old girl, led to outrage, and within months Parliament raised the age of consent from 13 to 16. Yet the very need for such reform laid bare the cruelty that thrived beneath the surface of Victorian virtue. The brothels themselves were not always secret. Some became infamous social spots, visited by poets, actors, even politicians. Oscar Wilde, though better remembered for his wit and his tragic trial, was rumoured to have wandered these spaces, where artists and aristocrats mingled with sex workers in a haze of absinthe and whispers. Pleasure and danger intertwined in these rooms, their walls heavy with secrets. But London was not alone. Other Victorian cities carried their own underworlds. In Liverpool, port brothels catered to sailors from around the world, offering an exchange not just of bodies but of cultures. In Manchester, industrial wealth created gentlemen-s clubs where erotic performances pushed boundaries under the cover of exclusivity. Across Britain, every booming city had its hidden counterpart, a darker twin born from the very prosperity of the empire. And then there were the underground clubs of the elite. The most notorious was the Cleveland Street scandal of 1889, where a male brothel was discovered operating out of a quiet townhouse in London. Its clientele included aristocrats, military officers, even those close to the royal family. The scandal made headlines, and though efforts were made to suppress names, whispers spread. For Victorians, nothing was more shocking than the idea that those who enforced morality might indulge in the very vices they condemned. Yet even as the press feasted on scandal, countless smaller stories went untold. A maid caught in an affair with her master, dismissed in shame. A young clerk arrested for gross indecency in a public lavatory. A seamstress who supplemented her income through secret liaisons. For every sensational trial, there were thousands of private tragedies and passions hidden behind curtains, buried in silence. What makes this underworld so haunting is not just its existence, but its scale. Far from being rare, these practices were widespread, woven into daily life. The Victorians built their empire on trade, science, and morality. Yet, in its very heart, in its capital, pulsed a thriving culture of sex, scandal, and secrecy. So, what does this tell us about the Victorian soul? That repression doesn't kill desire. It only makes it more inventive, more dangerous, more alive. That beneath every polished shoe and stiff collar, every bonnet and parasol, beat a heart that longed, feared, and surrendered to temptation. And it leaves us with a question. When society polices desire so harshly, does it truly prevent sin, or does it simply create darker shadows for it to flourish in? If the brothels and alleys revealed the underworld of Victorian sex, the marital bedroom revealed its contradictions in plain sight. For behind every respectable home with lace curtains and polished silverware was a marriage shaped not only by love or companionship, but by duty, silence, and expectation. Marriage in Victorian Britain was considered the cornerstone of society. The household was a miniature kingdom, with the husband as its ruler and the wife as his subject. Conduct books, sermons, and advice manuals filled shelves, each outlining a woman's role as guardian of morality and a man's duty as provider. Sex, according to these texts, was not about pleasure. It was about procreation. Anything else was indulgence, if not sin. Yet human desire is not so easily contained. Medical authorities of the day insisted that women were naturally passionless. Dr. William Acton, writing in 1857, declared that the majority of women, happily for society, are not very much troubled with sexual feeling of any kind. This single line became gospel, repeated in pulpits, pamphlets, and parlors. Women were expected to submit to their husbands without question, not to seek their own pleasure. A good wife endured her husband's embraces in silence, her virtue measured by her modesty, but reality often shattered these ideals. Diaries, private letters, and court testimonies reveal that many women longed for intimacy, and many men struggled with the weight of expectation. A husband might seek excitement with prostitutes or mistresses, while his wife quietly confided her frustrations to a friend. For some, this created marriages of cold civility, where affection existed but passion withered. For others, it drove a desperate search for outlets beyond the marital bed. One striking example comes from the diary of Lady Harriet Granville, who in the 1820s confessed her longing for more tenderness from her husband. Though bound by duty, she wrote of her yearning for warmth, a phrase that hints at the loneliness behind aristocratic marriages. Decades later, similar confessions appear in letters from middle-class women, describing the pain of unfulfilled desires, the ache of being treated as an object of duty rather than a partner in passion. At the same time, men were trapped by their own contradictions. Respectable husbands were expected to be disciplined, restrained, and faithful. Yet the culture around them whispered other possibilities. Brothels, mistresses, and pornography offered outlets for pleasure denied in marriage. Some justified their visits by claiming they protected their wives from venereal disease, an irony since they were often the ones bringing it home. The result was a double standard that shaped Victorian life. A man's sexuality was acknowledged, even indulged, while a woman's was erased. A wife's honor was her purity. A husband's honor was his reputation, and yet cracks appeared in this rigid structure. By the 1870s and 1880s, feminist voices began to argue that women not only had the right to refuse their husbands, but the right to enjoy intimacy on their own terms. Pamphlets by writers like Eliza Lynn Linton and campaigns by groups such as the Ladies' National Association challenged the silence surrounding marital sex. But even within marriages, secrecy thrived. Contraceptives, though taboo, circulated under the counter. Sponges, douches, and rubber sheaths allowed couples to control family size, though many were unreliable. The Fruits of Philosophy trial in 1877, which scandalized the nation, had its greatest impact not in courtrooms but in households, where whispered knowledge spread about how to separate pleasure from procreation. For couples brave enough to experiment, this opened the door to a new, though dangerous, kind of intimacy. And yet, in many homes, silence reigned. Parents avoided discussing sex with their children, leaving young brides and grooms unprepared for their wedding nights. Letters from newlywed women in the 1860s and 70s describe shock, pain, and confusion, some even mistaking intercourse for assault. So little had they been told. The lack of education bred fear, and fear bred repression. But where silence dominated, scandal lurked close behind. Courts recorded numerous cases of criminal conversation, a polite term for adultery. Newspapers devoured these trials, reporting every sordid detail to a public hungry for stories of sin behind closed doors. One infamous case in 1858, involving Lady Mordaunt, revealed her affairs with several men, including the Prince of Wales himself. The scandal splashed across headlines, proving once again that the very people preaching morality were often the first to break its rules. Still, not all was repression and scandal. For some couples, intimacy within marriage was tender, even passionate. Letters between Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, though heavily censored in later publications, reveal genuine warmth and affection. Victoria wrote of Albert as her darling angel, confessing to being overwhelmed by her love. Their marriage may have been idealized, but it stands as proof that not every Victorian union was loveless or cold. Beneath the weight of expectation, many couples carved out private worlds of intimacy that defied the era's dogma. But for those who could not, the consequences could be devastating. Women accused of frigidity or infidelity could be confined to asylums, their desires, or lack thereof, labeled as madness. Men accused of impotence faced ridicule and ruin. The marital bed, supposedly a place of unity, could easily become a battlefield where power, silence, and fear replaced love. So we are left with another paradox. The Victorians built their homes on ideals of purity, but their bedrooms told another story, one of silence, secrecy, longing, and, sometimes, quiet rebellion. And it raises a haunting question. In a society that denied women's pleasure and policed men's desire, how many marriages were built on lies? How many couples smiled in portraits, while behind closed doors they lived as strangers? So now we arrive at the end of our journey through the Victorian night, through its drawing rooms and its back alleys, its medical offices and its marriage beds. And what do we see when the gaslights fade and the curtains close? A society obsessed with morality, yet consumed by desire. A world that wrapped itself in purity, yet sewed its very seams with scandal. The Victorians preached restraint, but they could not stop themselves from producing more erotic literature than ever before. They condemned masturbation, yet invented devices to indulge it. They elevated women as models of virtue, while exploiting thousands in brothels and backstreets. They outlawed homosexuality, while members of parliament risked everything in secret clubs and quiet townhouses. It was an age of contradiction. Take the very symbol of Victorian respectability, the photograph of a stiff family. Faces stern, clothes immaculate, children posed like porcelain dolls. Behind those portraits, however, the same families might be hiding sons arrested for gross indecency, daughters dismissed for secret pregnancies, fathers visiting flagellation parlors, mothers confiding longings in hidden letters. Respectability was a performance, and everyone, in some way, was acting. Even Queen Victoria herself, whose name defines the era, offers a telling paradox. To the public, she was the embodiment of moral order. But in her private correspondence, she gushed about her passion for Prince Albert, describing their embraces with an intimacy that shocked her editors so much that later publications censored them. If even the monarch could not resist desire, what hope was there for her subjects? And so, beneath the rigid structures of empire, desire thrived in every crack. In Manchester's slums, young couples risked scandal for moments of intimacy. In London's brothels, aristocrats and labourers alike indulged in forbidden fantasies. In medical offices, women found relief through treatments that blurred the line between medicine and pleasure. In parliamentary debates, pamphlets on contraception sparked fury and fascination. What makes the Victorian era so haunting is not just its contradictions, but its closeness to us. For though a century and more has passed, the same themes linger. The battle between morality and desire, the tension between public image and private truth, the endless attempt to control sexuality, and the equal determination of people to resist that control. Perhaps that is the true secret of the Victorian age. Repression was never the point, it was the game. The thrill lay not in purity, but in breaking purity's rules. In the strict codes of the age, pleasure became sharper, scandal more intoxicating, secrets more irresistible. Desire didn't die in the shadows, it flourished there. And what of the human cost? For every scandal that titillated newspapers, there were tragedies too heavy for print. Women cast out for pregnancies, confined to asylums, or driven to desperate acts. Men imprisoned for love, their names dragged through courts. Children born into poverty, marked as illegitimate, carrying the burden of society's double standards. The Victorian obsession with sex was not only titillating, it was cruel. Yet even cruelty could not silence longing. Diaries still speak of yearning. Letters still pulse with passion. Photographs still survive, tucked in envelopes, capturing glimpses of stockings and laughter in a world that pretended such things did not exist. These relics whisper to us across time. The Victorians were not so different from us. They longed, they loved, they sinned, they suffered. They lived in contradiction, just as we do. And so, as we close this story, we must ask, what does it mean that the most prudish age was also one of the most sexual? Does repression always create more passion? Does silence make desire louder? Or do we see in the Victorians not just a distant age, but a mirror of ourselves? Our own hypocrisies, our own secrets, our own obsessions. Perhaps the greatest dark secret of the Victorian era is not that they were obsessed with sex, but that they were honest enough, in their own hidden way, to record it. In their scandals, in their court cases, in their medical texts and their novels, they left us a map of human desire. One that shows, no matter how tightly society tries to bind it, passion always escapes. This has been Whispers of History. Thank you for walking with us through lace and lamplight, through silence and scandal, through the shadows of the Victorian night. If you've enjoyed uncovering these secrets, subscribe and join us for more stories that history tried to hide, because in every age, the whispers are still there, waiting to be heard.